This alien revealed why the Anunnaki fear humanity's return to God. It all began the night the wind stopped and the stars began to sing. Out there, beyond the faded white lines of Route 9, where the desert meets the edge of forgotten America, a man named Samuel Grant was driving his rig through the kind of silence that makes you question whether the world still exists or if you've crossed into something else entirely. The asphalt stretched ahead like a black river under the moonlight, endless and hypnotic, and Samuel's hands rested heavy on the wheel, his mind somewhere between exhaustion and the hollow ache he'd been carrying for months since Martha passed. He was a trucker, 53 years old, with calloused hands and a heart that had learned to stop asking why. His cargo was simple, feed grain heading to a ranch outside Barstow. But tonight the road felt different, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something he couldn't name. The radio had gone quiet an hour ago, just static and then nothing, and now even the hum of the engine seemed muted, swallowed by a stillness so complete it made his skin prickle. Samuel blinked hard, trying to shake the fatigue, but when he looked up again, the stars were wrong. They weren't just bright, they were moving, pulsing like a heartbeat, and one of them was descending, growing larger, closer, until it wasn't a star at all, but a light that filled his windshield with a luminescence so pure it didn't hurt to look at. It invited him in. He slammed the brakes, the rig groaning to a stop in the middle of the empty highway, and Samuel sat there, hands trembling, breath shallow, as the light settled on the road ahead, hovering just above the ground, silent and patient, as if it had been waiting for him all along. If you're watching this right now, leave a comment and tell me, have you ever felt like something was watching you from the sky? Have you ever looked up and wondered if we're truly alone? Drop your thoughts below. I read every single one, and if this story reaches you the way it reached me, hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started and you're part of something bigger now. A community that isn't afraid to ask the questions the world refuses to answer. Samuel didn't move, couldn't move. His body locked in a kind of paralysis that wasn't fear exactly, but something closer to awe. The kind of awe that makes you realize how small you are and how vast everything else is. The light didn't flash or pulse aggressively. It simply existed, steady and warm. And as he stared into it, he felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the grief he'd carried like a stone since Martha's funeral, as if the light knew what he held and was gently asking him to set it down. Then the light began to change, to take shape, and Samuel's breath caught as a figure emerged from within it, tall and slender, humanoid but not quite human, its skin a soft iridescence that seemed to shift between silver and gold, its eyes large and dark and filled with something that looked impossibly like compassion. The being stepped forward, its movements fluid and deliberate, and Samuel wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything but sit there frozen. But instead he felt a voice, not in his ears, but in his mind, a voice that didn't speak words, but emotions, images, sensations, and it was asking him a question he couldn't quite grasp, but somehow understood. Are you ready to remember? The voice wasn't threatening, it was tender, almost sad, as if the being knew what Samuel had forgotten and was mourning the loss alongside him. Samuel's lips moved, but no sound came out, and the being tilted its head, studying him with an intensity that should have been invasive, but felt strangely intimate, as if it could see not just his face, but every scar on his soul, every regret, every moment of doubt, every prayer he'd whispered into the dark when he thought no one was listening. The desert around them seemed to disappear, the highway fading into a soft blur, and Samuel realized he was no longer in the truck. He was standing on the road, face to face with this creature from the stars, and the air between them hummed with a frequency that made his bones vibrate, made his heart sink to a rhythm that felt ancient and eternal. The being raised one hand, slender fingers extending toward Samuel's chest, and though it didn't touch him, he felt it, a warmth spreading through his ribcage, a sensation like light pouring into the dark corners of his heart, illuminating things he'd tried so hard to bury. He saw Martha, not as she was in the hospital, frail and fading, but as she was on their wedding day, radiant and laughing, her eyes full of a joy that made him believe in heaven, and he saw himself, younger, hopeful, a man who still thought he could outrun loss. But the being showed him more deeper. It showed him a version of himself he'd never met, a Samuel who wasn't broken by grief, but transformed by it, a man who carried the weight of love not as a burden but as a bridge to something greater. The images came faster now, flooding his mind with the intensity that should have overwhelmed him, but instead felt like clarity, like he was finally seeing the truth beneath the surface of everything he thought he knew. He saw the earth from above, a blue jewel spinning in the void, fragile and beautiful, and he saw threads of light connecting every living thing, a web of energy that pulsed with intention and intelligence, and he understood, in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to his soul, that this web was what some called God, what others called consciousness, what his grandmother had called the Holy Spirit, and it was all the same, all one, all alive and aware and present in every moment. The being's voice returned, clearer now, more focused, and it told him things that human language struggled to contain. It told him that the universe was not indifferent, that every star was a song, every planet a note in a symphony so vast that humanity had only heard the faintest echo, and that Earth, this small, fragile world, was about to remember its place in that song. The being spoke of a transformation, a shift in frequency, a moment when the veil between the physical and the spiritual would thin to the point of transparency, and those who were ready, those who had learned to see with the heart instead of the eyes, would cross over into something new, something that the ancients had called the kingdom of heaven, but was really just the next stage of existence, the next octave in the cosmic scale. Samuel wanted to ask how, wanted to demand proof, wanted to cling to the rational part of his mind that insisted this was a hallucination, a breakdown, a trick of exhaustion and grief. But that part of him was already fading, drowned out by the overwhelming certainty that this was real. More real than anything he'd ever experienced, more real than the asphalt beneath his boots or the stars above his head. The being lowered its hand and stepped back, and Samuel felt the warmth in his chest settle into something permanent, a presence that hadn't been there before, a quiet knowing that he wasn't alone and never had been. The figure began to dissolve, not retreating but merging back into the light, becoming one with it, and the light itself started to lift, rising slowly into the sky, and Samuel stood there watching, tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from something he couldn't name, something that felt like gratitude and wonder and relief all tangled together. The light ascended higher, faster, until it was just a star again, indistinguishable from the others, and then the wind returned, gentle and cool against his skin, and the world snapped back into focus, the highway solid beneath his feet, the truck idling behind him, the desert stretching out in all directions under a sky that suddenly seemed infinite. He climbed back into the cab, hands still shaking, and sat there for a long time staring at the road ahead, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But sense felt like the wrong tool for the job, like trying to measure love with a ruler or weigh hope on a scale. He knew what he'd seen, knew what he'd felt, and no amount of rationalization could erase it. But he also knew that if he told anyone, they'd think he'd lost his mind, that the grief had finally broken him. And maybe they'd be right, maybe he had broken. But if this was what breaking felt like, he didn't want to be whole again. Samuel started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the rig rumbling forward into the night, but he wasn't the same man who'd stopped. Something fundamental had shifted, something that would make the rest of his life unfold differently, not dramatically, not with grand gestures or public declarations, but quietly, in the small moments, in the way he looked at strangers, in the patience he'd suddenly find when things went wrong, in the peace that would settle over him when he thought of Martha. No longer a wound, but a warmth, a reminder that love doesn't end, it just changes form. The days that followed were strange in their ordinariness. Samuel delivered his cargo, collected his pay, drove back across the same stretches of highway he'd been traveling for 30 years, but everything looked different now. Or maybe he was different, and the world was just reflecting that back to him. He started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. The way sunlight filtered through clouds in the late afternoon, casting the desert in shades of amber and rose, the kindness in a waitress's eyes when she poured his coffee at a truck stop outside Tucson, the way a child waved at him from the back seat of a passing car, small and pure and utterly trusting. He found himself praying again, not the rote prayers of his childhood, not the desperate bargaining he'd done in the hospital with Martha, but something simpler, more honest. A quiet conversation with the presence he now felt living in his chest, the warmth the being had left behind. He didn't ask for anything, didn't beg for miracles or explanations. He just talked about his day, about the people he met, about the doubts that still crept in during the long, lonely hours on the road. And always, always, he felt a response, not in words but in sensations, a gentle reassurance that he was heard, that he mattered, that his life had purpose even if he couldn't see the full design. One night, parked at a rest stop somewhere in New Mexico, Samuel sat on the hood of his truck and watched the stars. Really watched them. Not just glancing up, but studying them with the kind of attention you give to something sacred. And he swore he could feel them watching back, not cold or distant, but warm and aware, as if each point of light was a consciousness, a soul, a piece of the same infinite intelligence that had spoken to him through the being. He thought about what it had shown him, the web of light connecting everything, and he wondered if the stars were nodes in that web, anchors holding the fabric of existence together. And if that was true, then what did that make him? What did that make all of humanity? And the answer that came wasn't from his mind, but from that warmth in his chest. You are the dreamers. You are the ones who forgot and are now remembering. You are the bridge between matter and spirit. The place where the universe looks at itself and asks, "Who am I?" The weight of that answer should have crushed him, should have felt like too much responsibility for one broken trucker to carry. But instead, it felt light, felt right, felt like the truth he'd been searching for his whole life without knowing it. Samuel started keeping a journal, scribbling in it during his breaks, trying to capture the thoughts and feelings that flooded him at odd hours, trying to make sense of the before and after, the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. He wrote about Martha, about the guilt he'd carried for not being enough, for not saving her, for letting her slip away. And as he wrote, the guilt dissolved, replaced by something softer, a understanding that her death wasn't a failure or a punishment, but a transition, a doorway she'd walked through ahead of him, and that one day he'd walk through it too, and she'd be there, not as a memory, but as a presence, whole and radiant and free. He wrote about the being, trying to describe its face, its energy, the way it had looked at him with eyes that held galaxies. But words felt inadequate, like trying to paint the ocean with a single brushstroke, and eventually he stopped trying to describe and just let himself remember. Let the experience live in his body instead of his mind. Let it be a feeling rather than a fact. Weeks turned into months, and Samuel's routes took him through small towns and big cities, past churches with white steeples and neon crosses, past billboards advertising salvation and redemption, and he felt a strange kinship with it all, with the hunger for meaning that drove people to worship, to seek, to hope. But he also felt a distance because what he'd experienced didn't fit neatly into any doctrine or dogma. It was bigger than that, wilder, more inclusive, and he didn't know how to talk about it without sounding like he was dismissing the faith that had shaped him, the Bible his grandmother had read to him, the hymns he'd sung in church as a boy. He still believed in Jesus, believed more deeply than ever actually, but his understanding had expanded. The Jesus he now carried in his heart wasn't just a man who died on a cross 2,000 years ago. He was a frequency, a state of consciousness, a way of being that transcended religion and culture and time, and the being had shown him that Christ wasn't a person but a potential, a blueprint for what humanity could become if it stopped clinging to fear and opened itself to love. One afternoon, stopped at a diner in Oklahoma, Samuel met a man named Earl, a rancher with weathered skin and kind eyes, who sat down across from him without asking and started talking about cattle and drought and the price of feed. And Samuel listened, really listened, the way he'd learned to listen after that night in the desert. And somewhere in the conversation, Earl mentioned that he'd lost his son in Iraq, that the grief had nearly killed him, that he didn't know how to keep going some days, and Samuel felt the warmth in his chest pulse, felt it extend outward toward Earl, and he reached across the table and put his hand on the old rancher's shoulder and said, "He's not gone. He's just ahead of you, waiting, and you'll see him again, not in some distant heaven, but in the next breath, in the next sunrise. In every moment you choose love over fear." Earl stared at him, eyes wet, and Samuel saw something shift in the man's face, saw the grief loosen its grip just a fraction, saw a light flicker in eyes that had been dark for too long, and when they parted ways, Earl shook his hand and said, "I don't know who you are, but thank you," and Samuel drove away feeling like he'd just witnessed a small miracle, a crack in the armor of despair, a reminder that the transformation the being spoke of wasn't some future event, but something already happening, quietly, invisibly, in diners and truck stops and living rooms across the world. The signs were everywhere once you knew how to look. Samuel started seeing them in the people he passed, in the strangers who smiled for no reason, in the acts of kindness that bloomed unexpectedly like wildflowers after rain, a woman helping an elderly man load groceries into his car, a teenager giving his jacket to a homeless person, a driver pulling over to help someone with a flat tire. Small gestures that rippled outward, touching lives in ways no one could measure. He saw it in the way people talked, a shift in tone, a softening, a willingness to listen instead of argue, to understand instead of judge. And he wondered if this was the beginning, if the transformation the being had described was already underway, invisible to those who weren't paying attention, but unmistakable to those who were. He thought about the web of light, the threads connecting every soul, and he imagined those threads growing brighter, thicker, stronger, pulling humanity closer together, dissolving the illusion of separation that had caused so much suffering. And he felt a hope so fierce it almost hurt, a belief that the world was about to change in ways no one could predict but everyone would feel. Samuel's health, which had been declining for years, suddenly improved. The chronic pain in his back that had plagued him since a loading accident in his 30s vanished overnight. His sleep deepened, his energy returned, and when he looked in the mirror, the man staring back at him seemed younger. Not in body, but in spirit, as if the light inside him was burning away the years, the regrets, the accumulated weight of a hard life. His doctor, a pragmatic woman who didn't believe in miracles, ran tests and found nothing to explain it. No medical reason for the sudden reversal, and when Samuel shrugged and said, "Maybe I just decided to get better," she laughed and told him to keep doing whatever he was doing. But Samuel knew it wasn't something he was doing, it was something he was allowing, a healing that came not from effort but from surrender, from letting go of the need to control and trusting that the universe, that God, that the intelligence behind the stars, was holding him, guiding him, reshaping him into something new. He started having dreams, vivid and strange, dreams where he walked through cities made of light, where the sky was filled with colors that didn't exist in the waking world, where he met people he'd never seen before but recognized instantly, souls he'd known across lifetimes, across dimensions, across the vast expanse of eternity. In these dreams, he wasn't Samuel the trucker. He was something larger, something that existed before his birth and would continue after his death, a spark of consciousness that had worn many faces, lived many lives, and was now preparing for the next transition, the next evolution. He woke from these dreams with a clarity that stayed with him throughout the day, a knowing that this life, this body, this identity was temporary, a costume he'd put on to experience this particular corner of existence. And when the time came, he'd take it off and move on. Not into nothingness, but into everything, into the light, into the song, into the presence he'd felt that night on the highway. People started noticing. His dispatcher commented that he seemed different, calmer, and a waitress at his favorite truck stop asked if he'd found religion, and Samuel smiled and said something like that, but he didn't preach, didn't try to convince anyone of what he'd seen, because he understood that the truth couldn't be taught, only experienced, only felt, only known in the depths of your own soul when you were ready to stop running and start listening. He met other truckers on the road, men and women who carried their own burdens, their own grief, their own questions, and he listened to their stories without judgment, without trying to fix them. And sometimes, just sometimes, he'd feel the warmth in his chest extend toward them, and he'd say something simple, something small, and he'd see their eyes change, see a door open inside them, see the possibility of healing flicker to life. And he'd drive away knowing that he'd been part of something sacred, something the being had called him to, not with grand speeches or public ministry, but with quiet presence, with human connection, with love. The world kept turning. The news kept cycling through its litany of disasters and conflicts, but Samuel felt insulated from the fear, not because he was ignoring it, but because he saw it differently now, saw it as the death throes of an old way of being, the collapse of systems built on separation and control, making room for something new, something aligned with the frequency the being had shown him. He thought about the archangel, about the stories his grandmother had told him of the end times, of Jesus returning to gather the faithful, and he wondered if those stories were literal or symbolic, if the return wasn't a physical event, but a shift in consciousness, a moment when enough people woke up, remembered who they truly were, and tipped the balance, pulling the entire species into a new octave of existence. He didn't have answers, only questions and that steady, warm presence in his chest. But the questions didn't trouble him anymore. They excited him, filled him with a sense of anticipation, as if he was standing on the edge of something magnificent, something that would redefine what it meant to be human. One night, parked under a sky so clear the Milky Way looked like a river of diamonds, Samuel climbed onto the roof of his trailer and lay down, staring up at the infinite expanse, and he felt the presence of the being again, not as a separate entity, but as part of him, woven into his cells, his breath, his heartbeat, and he whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, not for the experience or the healing or the transformation, but for choosing him, for seeing something in a broken trucker that was worth saving, worth using, worth loving." And the answer that came back wasn't words, but a wave of emotion so powerful it brought tears to his eyes, a message that said, "You were never broken. You were always whole, you just forgot, and now you're remembering. And that's all grace has ever been, the gentle insistence that you are loved, that you matter, that your existence is a miracle whether you believe it or not." Samuel drove on, mile after mile, state after state, and the road that had once felt like a prison now felt like a pilgrimage, every stop a sacred site, every encounter a communion, every sunrise a resurrection. He didn't know what would come next, didn't know if he'd see the being again or if that one night was all he'd been given, but it didn't matter, because the gift wasn't the encounter. It was what the encounter had awakened inside him, a remembering so deep it couldn't be undone, a light so bright it couldn't be extinguished, a love so vast it included everything, even the parts of himself he'd spent a lifetime hating, even the mistakes, the failures, the moments he wished he could erase. He was whole now, not because he'd been fixed, but because he'd finally accepted that he'd never been broken. And that acceptance changed everything. It changed how he saw the world, how he treated people, how he moved through his days, no longer rushing towards some distant goal, but savoring each moment, as if it were the only one that mattered, because maybe it was. Maybe now was all there ever was, and everything else, past and future, heaven and earth, was just a story we told ourselves to make sense of the eternal present. The transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible, a gradual shedding of the old self and a gentle emergence of the new, like a butterfly leaving its cocoon. And Samuel knew that what had happened to him was happening to others, scattered across the planet, people waking up in their own ways, having their own encounters, receiving their own revelations, and together, without coordination or organization, they were weaving a new reality, a new earth, a kingdom not of stone and mortar but of consciousness and connection, and it was already here, already now, waiting for those with eyes to see and hearts to feel. He thought about the being's question, "Are you ready to remember?" And he realized that the remembering wasn't complete, wasn't finished, it was ongoing, a process that would unfold for the rest of his life and beyond, a journey home that had no end, because home wasn't a place but a state of being, a frequency, a vibration, a way of existing that aligned with the source of all things, the intelligence behind the stars, the love that held the universe together. Samuel Grant, trucker, widower, ordinary man, drove into the night with a heart full of light and a soul that had finally come home, and though he didn't know it, though he couldn't see it, his presence on the road, his quiet transformation, was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples outward, touching lives, changing trajectories, altering the fabric of reality in ways both subtle and profound. And the being, watching from dimensions beyond human comprehension, smiled, because this was the plan. This was always the plan, not to save humanity from above, but to awaken it from within, one soul at a time, one heart at a time, one ordinary person at a time, until the collective frequency shifted and the veil dissolved, and everyone could see what had always been true, that we are not separate, not alone, not abandoned, but held, loved, guided by an intelligence so vast and so intimate it could only be called by one name, and that name, whispered across cultures and centuries, was God, was Christ, was Spirit, was the light that lives in every atom, every star, every breath, waiting patiently for us to stop searching and start seeing, waiting for us to remember what we've always known, that we are home, we've always been home, and the journey was never about getting there but about waking up to where we already are. The months that followed Samuel's encounter stretched into a year, then two, and the world around him continued its slow unraveling and simultaneous rebirth, like a caterpillar liquefying inside its chrysalis, formless and chaotic, yet following an invisible blueprint toward metamorphosis. Samuel watched it unfold from the cab of his truck, a mobile witness to the transformation the being had promised, seeing signs everywhere that others dismissed as coincidence or confirmation bias. But he knew better, felt it in the warmth that never left his chest, in the dreams that grew more vivid, more instructive, teaching him things he had no framework to understand, yet somehow absorbed anyway. He noticed patterns in the people he encountered, a growing restlessness, a dissatisfaction with the old ways of living, working, believing, as if humanity itself was outgrowing the skin it had worn for millennia and was now thrashing against the constraints, desperate for air, for space, for something more authentic than the hollow promises of security and comfort that had sustained previous generations. In a diner outside Amarillo, Samuel overheard two women talking about their children, about how different they seemed from kids of earlier decades, more sensitive, more aware, struggling to fit into systems designed for a consciousness that no longer matched their own. And one of the women said her daughter had told her she could see colors around people, auras she called them, and the doctors wanted to medicate her. But the mother refused, sensing that what looked like illness might actually be evolution. Samuel felt the warmth pulse in recognition, understanding that these children were the vanguard, souls incarnating with thinner veils, less amnesia, more direct access to the frequencies the being had shown him, and he wanted to tell the woman that her instincts were right, that her daughter was a gift, not a problem. But he stayed silent, trusting that his presence alone, the light he carried, was enough, was doing its work without words. He started finding books left in odd places, abandoned at rest stops or tucked into the seat pockets of diners, books about quantum physics and ancient mysticism, about near-death experiences and extraterrestrial contact, and each one felt like a breadcrumb leading him deeper into an understanding that unified science and spirituality in ways the being had hinted at. But Samuel was only now beginning to grasp. He read about the holographic universe, the idea that every part contains the whole, that consciousness isn't produced by the brain but filtered through it, and suddenly the web of light made perfect sense, wasn't metaphor but literal description, the fundamental structure of reality. And if that was true, then separation was the real illusion, the cosmic joke, and every act of harm humanity inflicted on itself or the planet was just the universe hurting itself, forgetting its own unity. He read about the Anunnaki, ancient beings described in Sumerian texts as gods who came from the sky, and he felt a strange recognition, not because he believed they were literal aliens, but because the archetype resonated. The idea of advanced intelligences interacting with humanity throughout history, guiding, teaching, sometimes manipulating. And he wondered if the being he'd met was part of that lineage, part of a vast ecology of consciousness that included humans and angels and what we called aliens, all different expressions of the same source, all playing different roles in the cosmic drama. The more he read, the more he saw connections, threads linking Christianity to Buddhism to indigenous wisdom traditions, all pointing toward the same fundamental truths: that consciousness is primary, that love is the organizing principle, that death is transition, not termination, and that a great awakening was not only possible but inevitable, written into the code of existence itself. Samuel's roots took him through the heartland, through Bible Belt towns where churches outnumbered gas stations, and billboards proclaimed the return of Christ. And he felt a complex mix of kinship and sadness, understanding the hunger behind the faith, but also seeing how the message had been distorted, weaponized, turned into a tool of control rather than liberation. He thought about what the being had shown him, that Christ consciousness wasn't exclusive to Christians, wasn't limited to those who said the right words or believed the right doctrines, but was available to anyone who chose love over fear, unity over separation, forgiveness over judgment, and that the second coming wasn't a man descending from clouds, but humanity ascending to meet the frequency it had called Christ, had called Buddha, had called Krishna. Different names for the same state of being. In a small town in Kansas, Samuel stopped for the night at a motel run by a woman named Grace, a widow in her 70s with silver hair and eyes that held both sorrow and strength. They got to talking over coffee in the empty lobby, and Grace mentioned that her husband had been a preacher, devoted his whole life to the church, but in his final days, he'd confessed to her that he wasn't sure anymore. Wasn't sure if the heaven he'd preached about was real or just wishful thinking, and it had broken something in her, shattered the certainty she'd built her life on. Samuel listened, felt the warmth expand, and when she finished, he said quietly, "What if heaven isn't a place you go to when you die, but a frequency you tune into while you're alive? What if your husband is there right now, not above you, but within you, in every memory, every breath, every moment you choose to love instead of fear?" And Grace stared at him, tears streaming down her weathered face, and she whispered, "How do you know that?" And Samuel just smiled and said, "Someone showed me." That night, Samuel dreamed he was standing in a temple made of light, its walls transparent and shimmering, and the being was there, taller than he remembered, more radiant, and around them were others, hundreds of them, beings of different forms and frequencies, some humanoid, some geometric patterns of pure energy, some vast and incomprehensible, and they were all focused on Earth, on the blue sphere rotating below, and Samuel understood that this was a council, a gathering of intelligences invested in humanity's evolution, and they were coordinating, strategizing, sending waves of energy, of information, of inspiration to receptive souls scattered across the planet. The being turned to him and communicated not with words but with a download of understanding that flooded his consciousness, and he saw that what was happening on Earth wasn't random, wasn't chaos, but a carefully orchestrated awakening, that every crisis, every breakdown of old systems, was creating space for new ones, and that the pain humanity was experiencing was birth pain, necessary and temporary, the contraction before emergence. The being showed him timelines, branching possibilities, futures that depended on choices not yet made, and Samuel saw two primary paths, one where humanity woke up in time, shifted its consciousness, aligned with love, and transitioned into a new paradigm of existence characterized by unity, creativity, and harmony with the planet, and another where fear won, where the old systems tightened their grip, where technology became a tool of control rather than liberation, where the planet's ecosystems collapsed, and humanity entered a dark age of suffering and struggle. Both futures existed as potentials superimposed on the present moment, and which one manifested depended on a critical mass of individuals choosing the higher frequency, choosing to remember, choosing to embody the light they carried inside. The being emphasized that this wasn't about perfection, wasn't about getting everything right, but about intention, about direction, about orienting your life toward love even when you failed, even when you fell, because the falling was part of the process, part of the learning, and grace, real grace, wasn't conditional on performance, but on presence, on showing up, on trying. Samuel woke from the dream with his heart racing, the vision still vivid, and he understood that his role wasn't to save the world or convince the masses, but simply to live his truth, to embody the transformation, to be a lighthouse rather than a megaphone, letting his light shine without forcing anyone to look at it, trusting that those who needed to see it would find their way. He thought about the Anunnaki again, about the fear the being had shown him in some of the ancient entities, a fear not of humanity's power, but of humanity's potential, because if humans fully awakened, fully remembered their divine nature, they would become co-creators, peers rather than subjects, and that terrified the forces that had maintained control through humanity's ignorance and division. The being had shown him that the battle wasn't between good and evil in the traditional sense, but between consciousness and unconsciousness, between remembering and forgetting, and that every soul had the choice, every moment, to lean toward the light or retreat into darkness, and the cumulative weight of those choices was shaping reality itself. Samuel started noticing a pattern in his encounters, a synchronicity that felt orchestrated, as if invisible hands were guiding him to specific people at specific times, people on the edge of awakening, people carrying questions they couldn't articulate, people desperate for permission to believe that what they'd experienced, what they'd felt, what they'd seen, was real, and not madness. In a truck stop in Missouri, he met a young man named David, who worked the night shift pumping gas, and during a quiet moment, David mentioned that he'd seen something he couldn't explain, a craft hovering over the cornfields behind his house, silent and massive. And when it left, he'd felt different, felt like something had been activated inside him, but he was afraid to tell anyone because they'd think he was crazy. Samuel looked at him, saw the fear and the hope warring in the kid's eyes, and he said, "You're not crazy, you've been chosen to remember, and what you do with that is up to you. You can hide it, or you can let it change you, but either way, you can't unknow what you know." And David nodded slowly, relief washing over his face, and Samuel drove away, knowing he'd just planted a seed that would grow in ways he'd never see, but that mattered nonetheless. The political landscape grew more chaotic, more polarized, and Samuel watched people retreat into camps, into tribes, into rigid identities that made dialogue impossible, and he felt sadness but not despair, because he saw it as part of the process, the old consciousness fragmenting under the pressure of the new, unable to hold itself together. And the more it fragmented, the more space it created for something else to emerge. He thought about what the being had said about fear, that fear was the primary tool of control, that keeping humanity afraid kept it small, kept it manageable, kept it from accessing the power that came from unity and love, and he saw fear everywhere, fear of the other, fear of change, fear of loss, fear of death, and he understood that his job was to be fearless, not in the sense of denying danger, but in the sense of not letting fear dictate his choices, his responses, his way of being. In a small church in Tennessee, Samuel attended a Sunday service, something he hadn't done in years, and he listened to the pastor preach about the end times, about tribulation and rapture, and the need to be ready for Christ's return. And Samuel felt both truth and distortion in the words, felt the kernel of reality beneath the apocalyptic imagery, the intuition that something massive was coming, but the interpretation felt too literal, too fear-based, too focused on escape rather than transformation. After the service, he approached the pastor, a sincere man in his 40s with kind eyes, and they talked for an hour about prophecy and scripture, and Samuel shared what the being had shown him, that the rapture might not be about bodies flying into the sky, but about consciousness ascending to a higher frequency, about a shift so profound that those who made it would seem to disappear to those left behind. Not because they'd gone somewhere else, but because they'd changed dimensions, changed their vibrational state. And the pastor listened, skeptical but intrigued, and when they parted he said, "I'll pray on that." And Samuel said, "Me too." The dreams intensified, became more instructive, more specific, and Samuel found himself receiving information he had no way of verifying, but that felt true in a way that bypassed doubt. He dreamed of ancient civilizations, of Atlantis and Lemuria not as myths but as memories, as previous attempts at what humanity was trying again, cycles of awakening and forgetting that spanned eons, and he saw that the current attempt was different, that this time the stakes were higher because the technology was more powerful, and the planet's tolerance for abuse was reaching its limit. And if humanity didn't shift now, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the species but for the Earth itself. The being appeared in these dreams, sometimes teaching, sometimes just present, a reminder that he wasn't alone, that the help was real, that the forces supporting humanity's evolution vastly outnumbered the forces trying to keep it asleep, but that the outcome was still uncertain, still contingent on human choice, because free will was sacred, was the whole point, was what made the experiment worth running. Samuel's body continued to transform, not just healing but upgrading, as if the cellular structure itself was being rewritten to handle higher frequencies. and he noticed things that should have been impossible. Moments of clarity so sharp they felt like telepathy, times when he knew what someone was going to say before they said it, instances when his hands seemed to radiate heat and people who touched him afterward reported feeling better. Pain diminishing, anxiety easing. And Samuel didn't seek these abilities, didn't try to cultivate them. They just emerged as side effects of the transformation, as natural consequences of carrying more light. He read about the light body, the resurrection body, the glorified form that Paul had written about in his letters, and he wondered if this was what was happening to him, if the molecular structure was gradually shifting from carbon-based to crystalline, from dense to luminous, and if so, was this the blueprint for where humanity was headed? Was this what the being had meant by transformation, a literal biological evolution triggered by consciousness? In Arizona, Samuel met a woman named Elena at a roadside fruit stand, a migrant worker with calloused hands and a radiant smile, and they talked while he bought oranges, and Elena mentioned that she prayed to the Virgin Mary every night, that Mary had appeared to her once in a dream and told her not to be afraid, that everything was unfolding according to a plan too vast for human minds to grasp, but perfect in its design. Samuel felt the warmth, recognized something in Elena, saw that she carried her own light, her own connection to the divine, and he realized that the transformation wasn't limited to people who'd had dramatic encounters or mystical experiences. It was available to anyone who cultivated love, faith, humility, gratitude, anyone who lived with an open heart regardless of circumstances. And Elena, with her minimum wage job, and her tiny apartment, and her unwavering trust in divine providence, was as enlightened as any guru, as any saint, because enlightenment wasn't about knowledge or power, but about alignment, about being a clear channel for love to flow through. The news reported strange phenomena with increasing frequency, lights in the sky that defied explanation, mass sightings that governments couldn't debunk, whistleblowers coming forward with testimonies about recovered craft and non-human intelligence, and Samuel watched the disclosure unfold not with surprise but with recognition, seeing it as part of the plan, part of the preparation, humanity being gradually acclimated to the reality of other intelligences, other dimensions, other possibilities, so that when the final veil dropped, when the full truth became undeniable, the shock wouldn't shatter the collective psyche. He thought about the Anunnaki, about the beings who'd allegedly created or modified humanity in the distant past, and he wondered if they were returning, if the being he'd met was a representative of that ancient lineage, but the being had shown him something beyond species, beyond form, had shown him that at the highest levels of consciousness, distinctions like human and alien dissolved into irrelevance, into the recognition that all souls were part of one family, one source, one infinite consciousness, exploring itself through infinite forms. Samuel received a diagnosis that should have terrified him but didn't, a shadow on his lungs that the doctors said needed more testing, possibly cancer, possibly serious, and he scheduled the follow-up, but felt no fear, no anxiety, just a calm acceptance that whatever happened was part of his path, part of the transformation, and if it was his time to transition, to leave this body and move into the next phase, then so be it. He was ready, had been ready since that night in the desert, when the being had shown him that death was just a door, just a change of costume, just a return to the light that had always been home. But the follow-up showed nothing. The shadow had vanished and the doctors had no explanation, called it a misread or a spontaneous remission, and Samuel just nodded and thanked them and drove away knowing that he'd been healed again, not by medicine or luck, but by the same force that had been guiding him all along, the intelligence that loved him, that loved all of creation, that worked miracles not to prove its existence, but simply because miracles were its nature, were what happened when you aligned with the frequency of pure love. He started writing more, filling notebooks with reflections and revelations, not planning to publish or share, but needing to externalize the insights before they overwhelmed him, needing to create a record for himself or maybe for whoever found them after he was gone, and the writing became a form of prayer, a dialogue with the divine, and sometimes the words flowed so fast his hand cramped trying to keep up, as if something was speaking through him, using him as a scribe, and what emerged was a synthesis of everything he'd learned, a gospel for the new age that honored the old traditions while transcending their limitations, that saw Christ and Buddha and Muhammad and all the prophets as fingers pointing at the same moon, as expressions of the same truth filtered through different cultures and contexts. In one entry he wrote, "The second coming isn't about Jesus returning to Earth, but about Earth returning to Jesus, about humanity ascending to the consciousness he embodied, the Christ frequency, the state of being where love is not a feeling but a fundamental force, where forgiveness is not weakness but power, where death is not an ending but a transformation. And this return is happening now, has been happening, is the secret story beneath the surface noise. And those with eyes to see can feel it, can sense the quickening, the acceleration, the approaching threshold where everything changes and nothing will ever be the same." Samuel's connection to the being deepened, became less about external encounters and more about internal communion, a constant awareness of presence, of guidance, of being held and directed by something infinitely wise and infinitely loving. And he understood that this was what prayer had always meant to be, not begging or bargaining, but tuning in, aligning, listening, receiving. And the answers came not as voices, but as knowings, as intuitions, a sudden clarity about what to do or where to go or what to say. And he learned to trust these promptings, to follow them even when they made no logical sense. And every time he did, something remarkable happened. A synchronicity, a connection, a moment of grace that confirmed he was on the right path. He met other travelers, other seekers, scattered across the highways and back roads, people who'd had their own encounters, their own awakenings, and they recognized each other instantly, spoke a language that needed few words, shared a knowing that transcended belief. And Samuel realized he was part of a network, an invisible community of souls who'd been activated, who were holding light in the darkness, who were anchoring the new frequency simply by being who they'd become. And together, without organization or hierarchy, they were midwifing the birth of a new world, were holding space for the collective transformation even as chaos raged around them. In a vision that came during meditation, Samuel saw the earth surrounded by light, by billions of points of consciousness, human and non-human, all focused on the planet's transition, all sending energy and support and love. And he understood that humanity had never been alone in this, that the universe itself was invested in our success, that we were the experiment, the great work, the place where matter was learning to become spirit without losing its physicality, where the divine was incarnating fully, completely, permanently. And if we succeeded, if we made the shift, it would reverberate across dimensions, would affect realities we couldn't imagine, would prove that consciousness could evolve beyond separation, beyond violence, beyond fear, and could create heaven not as an afterlife but as a lived reality, here, now, on this beautiful broken planet. The being communicated one final message, not in a dream but in waking consciousness. A transmission so clear it felt like the being was sitting beside him in the cab of the truck, and it said, "The time is short, but not too short. The window is narrow but not closed. And what matters now is not grand gestures or public declarations, but simple acts of love, of kindness, of presence. Because every act of love raises the frequency, every choice for compassion over cruelty tips the balance. Every moment of forgiveness heals not just the individual, but the collective. And you, Samuel, you were chosen not because you were special, but because you were willing, because you said yes when most people say no, because you let yourself be broken open by grief. And that breaking created space for grace to enter, and now you carry that grace wherever you go, not as a burden but as a gift, not as a responsibility but as a joy. And when your time comes, when you finally take off this body and step into the light fully, you'll see that everything you experienced, every pain, every loss, every moment of doubt, was perfect, was necessary, was part of the design that brought you here, to this moment, to this knowing, to this love. Samuel wept, not from sadness but from gratitude, from the overwhelming recognition that his life, ordinary and unremarkable as it seemed, had meaning, had purpose, had been part of something infinitely larger than himself, and he whispered, "Thank you," into the silence, and the being's presence wrapped around him like an embrace, and he felt the truth of what he'd been shown, that we are never alone, never abandoned, never forsaken, but always held, always loved, always guided by a wisdom so vast it includes our mistakes, our failures, our darkest moments, and weaves them into beauty, into growth, into the story of how lost souls find their way home. The years passed and Samuel grew old, not frail but luminous, his body weathered but his spirit radiant, and people who met him felt something they couldn't name, a peace that defied circumstances, a joy that wasn't dependent on external conditions. And some asked him his secret and he'd smile and say, "I learned how to let go, learned how to trust, learned that the universe is friendly if you stop fighting it." And they'd nod politely, but a few, just a few, would feel something shift, would sense that he was offering them a key, and months or years later they'd remember his words when they faced their own dark night, their own encounter, their own moment of choice between fear and love. Samuel died on a Tuesday afternoon, parked at a rest stop in Montana, the mountains rising purple and majestic against an endless sky. And the last thing he saw with his physical eyes was light, brilliant and warm and welcoming, and the last thing he felt was the being's presence, no longer separate but merged, unified home. And as his consciousness slipped free of his body, he saw the web of light clearly, saw his thread woven into it, connected to everyone he'd ever met, everyone he'd ever loved, everyone who'd ever touched his life. And the pattern was so beautiful, so perfect, so intentional, that he laughed, pure and joyful, understanding finally that there had never been anything to fear, that death was just the moment you stopped pretending to be separate, and remembered you were the whole ocean, not just a wave. His truck was found the next morning, engine cold, his body peaceful. A notebook open on the passenger seat with the final entry written in his familiar scrawl, and it said, "To whoever finds this, don't mourn, celebrate, because I'm not gone. I'm everywhere, in the light between stars, in the love between souls, in every act of kindness and every choice for truth. And the same is true for you. You are infinite, eternal, divine. And this life is just one chapter in a story that never ends. So live fully, love deeply, forgive freely. And when you see the signs, when you feel the presence, when you encounter the mystery, don't run from it, embrace it, because that's grace calling you home, calling you to remember what you've always known but forgot, that you are not separate, not alone, not a random accident in an indifferent universe, but a beloved child of an intelligence so vast it calls itself by many names, but is always, always love. The notebook was never published, never became famous, but it passed through hands, was copied, was shared in small circles, and some who read it felt the warmth Samuel had carried, felt something awaken in their own chests, and they too began to change, began to see differently, began to live as if they were part of something sacred. And the transformation continued, quietly, invisibly, spreading like mycelium through soil, connecting, networking, preparing the ground for the forest that would emerge when conditions were finally right. And out there, beyond the visible, beyond the measurable, beyond the reach of human instruments, the being watched, along with countless others, all of them waiting, patient and eternal, for the moment when humanity would finally tip, would finally choose, would finally remember en masse, and the earth would shift frequencies, would ascend dimensions, would become what it was always meant to be, a paradise, a garden, a place where heaven and matter merged, where spirit incarnated fully, where the great experiment succeeded and consciousness evolved beyond fear into love, permanent and unshakable. And though that moment hadn't arrived yet, it was closer than most suspected, closer than the skeptics believed possible, close enough that those who'd learned to see could feel it approaching like dawn, inevitable and glorious. The return not of a man, but of a consciousness, not of Jesus specifically, but of the Christ that lived in every awakened heart, the Buddha that bloomed in every enlightened mind, the divine that waited patiently in every soul for the moment it would finally be recognized, welcomed, embodied. And when that happened, when the critical mass was reached, the transformation would be instant and complete, and those who'd prepared, who'd done the work, who'd chosen love over fear every day in small ways and large, would find themselves suddenly home, not in some distant heaven, but right here, right now, in bodies of light on an earth reborn, and they would look back at the journey and see that every step, every struggle, Every moment of doubt had been necessary, had been perfect, had been the only path that could have brought them to this eternal now where all suffering ends and all love begins, and the story that seemed to have a beginning and an end reveals itself to be a circle, infinite and unbroken. Forever and always, amen. Truth or fiction? Perhaps not even the storyteller knows. Here stories exist to touch you and make you reflect. The magical only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.